The wind-swept streets of Timber Creek had witnessed their share of bloodshed, but nothing like the storm that was about to break over this forgotten corner of the frontier. They say the most dangerous men are those who've learned the value of silence, and Ezra Blackwood was about to prove just how deadly quiet could be. This is the story of how the notorious Hastings gang made the fatal mistake of crossing paths with a drifter whose soft-spoken manner concealed a legend written in gun smoke and vengeance, a man whose very name once made even the most hardened outlaws seek shelter before the coming tempest. The merciless summer sun had finally surrendered to dusk as Ezra Blackwood sat motionless at a corner table in the Crossroads saloon, his untouched glass of water beading with condensation in the lingering heat. His weathered slouch hat cast deep shadows across eyes that had seen too much, revealing nothing while missing nothing. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The saloon bustled with the usual evening crowd, miners fresh from their claims, trail-weary cowboys, and the occasional drifter passing through, their boisterous conversations and raucous laughter filling the room with a fog of tobacco smoke and whiskey fumes. Yet Ezra remained apart from it all, a stillness at the center of chaos that seemed almost unnatural to those who bothered to notice. Josephine Harding, who'd run the Crossroads since her husband was killed in a failed stagecoach robbery 5 years earlier, had grown accustomed to Ezra's peculiar ways in the 2 months since he'd ridden into Timber Creek. Unlike the rambunctious patrons who frequented her establishment, Ezra never touched a drop of liquor, never joined the high-stakes poker games in the back room, and somehow managed to fade into the woodwork despite his imposing physique and the deputy's badge that occasionally glinted beneath his dust-colored duster. "You want something stronger tonight, Deputy Blackwood?" Josephine asked as she wiped down the bar nearby, her voice carrying the resilient strength of a woman who'd endured more than her share of frontier hardships. The crow's feet around her eyes deepened as she studied him with motherly concern. "You've been staring at that same glass of water for near an hour now." Ezra's response was a slight shake of his head, so minimal it might have been missed by anyone not accustomed to his economy of movement. His calloused fingers traced an invisible pattern on the scarred wooden table, seemingly counting something only he could see. Those who knew nothing of Ezra's past often mistook his silence for simplicity. Those rare few who knew even fragments of his story recognized it as the hard-earned discipline of a man constantly fighting to keep his demons leashed. The evening had settled into its familiar rhythm when the first warning signs of trouble pushed through the bat-wing doors. 3 riders from the Hastings gang sauntered in, trail dust still clinging to their clothes, the smell of horse sweat and trouble following them like a shadow. They wore their gun belts low and tied down, the mark of men who used their weapons more than their wits. Few understood why Marshal Jenkins had pinned a deputy's badge on such a quiet stranger 3 months ago, making him a lawman alongside the more vocal and hot-headed Deputy Liam Taylor. Some speculated it was Ezra's unnerving calm that had convinced the aging marshal, while others whispered about a mysterious letter of recommendation that Jenkins kept locked in his desk drawer. Whatever the reason, the decision had raised eyebrows throughout Timber Creek, particularly among those who found Ezra's watchful silence unsettling. "Well, ain't this a fine establishment?" the tallest of the Hastings men announced, his spurs jingling with exaggerated steps as he approached the bar. Jackson Reed was his name, though most called him Rattler, for the distinctive sound of his approach and his habit of striking without warning. His eyes carried the dangerous gleam of a predator as he reached across the polished bar top, grabbing Josephine's wrist with dirt-encrusted fingers. "How about some special treatment for the Hastings gang's finest pretty lady?" The saloon's piano player missed a note, the faltering melody matching the sudden tension that gripped the room. Several patrons discreetly made their way toward the exit, recognizing the prelude to violence when they saw it. The Hastings gang had been growing bolder over the past months, their leader, Victor Hastings, extending his reach across 3 counties with increasingly brutal tactics. Josephine winced, but kept her voice steady, years of dealing with troublemakers, evident in her measured tone. "Let go of me now, or I'll have no choice but to call for the marshal." Rattler's grip tightened as harsh laughter erupted from his companions. His thumb pressed against the pulse point on Josephine's wrist, a deliberately intimate threat. "Marshal Jenkins, that old fool knows better than to—" "Excuse me?" Ezra's soft voice somehow cut through the noise, like a well-honed blade. He rose slowly from his corner table, each movement deliberate and careful, as if he were handling something fragile rather than confronting armed outlaws. "The lady asked you to let go." The saloon fell silent as the 3 men turned their bleary eyes toward the sound, finding the deputy's badge on Ezra's chest. The one holding Josephine's wrist let out a bark of laughter that held no humor, only contempt. "Well, would you look at that, boys?" Jenkins's pet mute finally found his voice. Rattler's yellow-toothed grin widened as he twisted Josephine's arm slightly, making her stifle a gasp of pain. "You best turn around and sit back down. Deputy, this ain't your concern." Ezra's gaze remained fixed on the floorboards, his hands hanging loose at his sides in a way that seemed almost casual to the untrained eye. Only a very observant watcher would notice how his weight had shifted to the balls of his feet, how his breathing had slowed to an almost imperceptible rhythm. "Please release her and leave the saloon." Ezra's voice remained quiet, yet something in its tone caused several nearby patrons to edge farther away. "It's closing time." "Or what?" The second Hastings rider stepped forward, tobacco juice staining his unkempt beard, his hand hovering near his holstered Colt. Bull Durham was what they called him, not for his choice of tobacco, but for the bullish way he charged into fights, heedless of consequences. "You gonna make us, deputy?" The third man, a wiry figure known only as Coyote for his high-pitched laugh and scavenging ways, began circling toward Ezra's flank, his fingers flexing in anticipation. "Heard tell this one don't even carry a gun most days," he said, his voice carrying the rasp of too many desert trails. "Just that fancy knife in his boot. What kind of lawman fears his own sidearm, I wonder?" The moment stretched like pulled taffy, the entire saloon holding its collective breath until young Deputy Liam Taylor burst through the doors, his face flushed with urgency, star gleaming on his chest. "Ezra, there's trouble at the—" He froze, taking in the scene before him with widening eyes, his hand instinctively dropping to his holstered revolver. What followed seemed to happen between heartbeats. Rattler shoved Josephine roughly aside, sending her crashing into the shelf of bottles. Behind the bar as he reached for his gun, the movement was fast, faster than most men could follow, but before the weapon cleared leather, Ezra moved with a grace that seemed impossible for his size. Like water flowing around stones in a stream, he closed the distance in 2 fluid strides. 3 precise strikes delivered with almost gentle precision sent Rattler crashing to the floor, his unfired gun spinning across worn floorboards. The first strike had numbed his gun hand, the second had disabled his shoulder, and the third, a precise blow to a nerve cluster below his ear, had scrambled his senses completely. Bull Durham barely registered his companion's fall before Ezra's boot connected with the inside of his knee, collapsing the joint with a sickening sound. As the man toppled forward, Ezra redirected his momentum, using Bull's own weight to send him crashing into the bar with enough force to crack the thick wooden surface. Coyote managed to squeeze off a shot, the sound deafening in the confined space, but Ezra was no longer where he had been. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. Like a shadow slipping between lantern light, he appeared at Coyote's side, twisting the man's gun arm behind his back with such precise leverage that the bones snapped with an audible crack. The outlaw's scream dissolved into a whimper as Ezra systematically disarmed him, movement so economical they almost appeared gentle despite their devastating results. The entire exchange had lasted less than 15 seconds. Young Deputy Taylor remained frozen in the doorway, his mouth working soundlessly while Josephine pressed herself against the bar, clutching her bruised wrist. Broken glass crunched beneath her feet as she stared at Ezra with new eyes, seeing not the quiet deputy who'd kept to himself these past months, but something else entirely. Ezra had already returned to his corner table, head bowed as before, though keen eyes might have noticed the slight tremor in his hands as he lifted his water glass. The only other indication that he'd moved at all was the measured pace of his breathing, slightly deeper than normal, as if he were working through some private exercise to calm himself. Marshal Jenkins arrived minutes later, his slow, heavy footfalls and jingling spurs announcing his presence before he pushed through the doors. Though nearly 60, Jenkins carried himself with the hard-earned authority of a man who'd survived decades on the frontier. Deputy Taylor followed close behind, having recovered enough to fetch the marshal, his hand never straying far from his gun belt as he eyed the groaning men on the floor. Jenkins surveyed the scene with the practiced eye of a man who had seen. His share of saloon brawls, taking in the splintered furniture, broken glass, and 3 incapacitated outlaws with a single sweep of his steel-grey gaze. "These Hastings boys?" Jenkins asked, though the question seemed mere formality given the distinctive snake insignia on their gun belts, Hastings' personal brand for his most trusted men. Ezra offered a single nod, still not meeting the marshal's gaze. Jenkins's weathered face creased with something that might have been satisfaction. "Good work, son." He turned toward the younger deputy. "Liam, get Doc Patterson for these fools, then lock 'em up. Let 'em sleep it off before we question 'em." He turned his attention to Josephine. "You all right, Miss Harding?" "Yes, Marshal," Josephine answered, though her eyes remained fixed on Ezra's quiet form. "Thanks to your deputy here." Jenkins pulled up a chair across from Ezra, studying him with the kind of interest a man might show a new breed of rattlesnake, respectful wariness mixed with genuine curiosity. "You know, when you drifted into town 3 months back, barely, speaking above a whisper, some folks thought I was touched in the head to offer you a badge." Jenkins leaned forward, his voice dropping to a rumble only Ezra could hear. "But I've been wearing this star long enough to recognize a man who knows how to handle himself." He paused, weathered fingers drumming an unconscious pattern on the table. "Though I admit, I've never seen anyone move quite the way you just did. Not since those stories about—" His voice trailed off meaningfully. Something passed between the two men. An understanding, perhaps, or a warning. Jenkins nodded slowly, then pushed back from the table with a creak of old bones. "Get some rest, Ezra. Tomorrow's going to be interesting." Jenkins adjusted his hat with deliberate care. "Hastings ain't going to like hearing his boys got handled by one deputy, especially not—" He left the thought unfinished, but his meaning hung in the air between them. Ezra remained motionless, but something in his posture suggested acknowledgement. "Thing is," Jenkins continued as he headed for the door, pausing briefly with one hand on the frame, "I don't much care what Hastings likes. This is my town." His boots echoed on the wooden sidewalk as he disappeared into the gathering darkness. As night settled over Timber Creek, most residents secured their doors a little more carefully than usual, aware that something had shifted in their small corner of the frontier. In the saloon, Josephine quietly swept up broken glass while Ezra remained in his corner, watching the shadows lengthen across the floor. Tomorrow would bring trouble. It always did when men like Hastings, felt their pride had been wounded. But for now, in this quiet moment, Ezra allowed himself to remember why he had chosen this town, why he had accepted Jenkins's offer of a badge after 7 years of drifting, running from what he'd been, what he'd done. Maybe he had finally found a place worth protecting, if only the past would stay where he'd left it, buried beneath the unmarked graves that stretched from Texas to Montana. Monuments to a legend he'd been trying to outrun since the war. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying dust and whispers through Timber Creek's darkened streets. On the edge of town, 3 more riders from the Hastings gang arrived, unaware that their companions lay broken in the town jail. Their leader, Victor Hastings himself, would not be far behind, drawn by blood and pride to a confrontation that had been brewing since the moment a quiet stranger with deadly hands pinned on a deputy's badge. The wind whispered another name too, one that hadn't been spoken aloud in Timber Creek, though its echo had followed Ezra like a shadow across the Western Territories. The Ghost. The following morning dawned blood-red over Timber Creek, the rising sun casting crimson shadows across weathered buildings, as if foretelling the violence to come. The distant rumble of thunder promised a storm, though whether from nature or man remained to be seen. Ezra Blackwood walked the dusty main street with measured steps, acutely aware of how the town had changed overnight. Doors closed as he passed. Curtains twitched behind windows, and those few citizens who met his gaze did so with newfound wariness. Some with respect, others with undisguised fear. Word of last night's confrontation at the Crossroads Saloon had spread like wildfire, transforming the quiet deputy into something larger and more dangerous in the town's collective imagination. A group of children playing with hoops and sticks scattered at his approach, their games forgotten in their haste to clear his path. "Mama says you broke 3 men without even drawing your pistol," one brave boy called from a safe distance, eyes wide with a mixture of terror and admiration. Ezra paused, a flicker of something like regret crossing his features before disappearing behind his usual mask of calm. He'd spent years cultivating invisibility, and in one unguarded moment he'd shattered the careful anonymity he'd built. The whispers would grow, questions would follow, and eventually the past he'd fled would catch up to him once more. The telegraph office was his first stop. If Hastings followed his usual pattern, word would already be spreading about the humiliation of his men. Ezra needed to know what to expect and when. Abigail Porter, who ran the telegraph with ruthless efficiency despite being barely 20, straightened as he entered, her usual chatter silenced by his presence. Without prompting, she handed him 3 yellow slips. "These came through for Marshal Jenkins this morning," she said, her voice uncharacteristically formal. "Thought you ought to see them too." The first message was from the sheriff in Apache Springs. "Hastings gang spotted heading. North 7 riders, heavily armed." The second, from a railroad agent in Copper Junction. "Freight train robbed yesterday. 3 guards dead. Hastings insignia left at scene." The third made Ezra's blood run cold. "Unusual inquiries about Deputy Blackwood from military officials. Advise caution." Ezra handed the papers back to Abigail with a nod of thanks, his mind already calculating distances, likely routes, and potential points of ambush. Hastings would arrive within 2 days, 3 at most, but it was the third telegram that troubled him more. Military officials asking questions meant someone had recognized him, or worse, had been tracking him all along. "There's something else," Abigail said hesitantly, lowering her voice though they were alone in the office. "Marshal Jenkins received a private wire last night after the incident. I wasn't supposed to read it, but..." She bit her lip, professional propriety warring with the need to share vital information. It mentioned the ghost of Antietam and asked if rumors of his presence were true. Ezra's face remained impassive, but Abigail, ever sensitive to the subtlest shifts in expression, noticed how his pupils contracted slightly, how his breathing became deliberately measured. "Thank you, Miss Porter," he said softly. "It would be best if you forgot you saw that message." "Already forgotten, Deputy," she replied with a quick nod, though others might not be so discreet with their memories, especially if those memories involve a legendary army scout rumored to have single-handedly eliminated an entire Confederate raiding party during the war. Ezra tipped his hat and left without further comment, the weight of his past growing heavier. With each step, outside the morning had progressed, the streets filling with the usual traffic of wagons and riders. He moved deliberately toward the marshal's office, cataloguing every detail of his surroundings through habit. The leather goods store had a new shipment, saddles stacked in the window. The blacksmith was shoeing an unfamiliar dapple grey, probably belonging to the cattle buyer staying at the hotel. Two strangers loitered outside the bank, their city clothes and watchful eyes marking them as out of place. He filed these observations, automatically part of the heightened awareness that had kept him alive through 2 wars, one official, one personal. Dr. Eleanor Finch was just opening her clinic as Ezra passed. Unlike most of the townspeople, her demeanor betrayed no changed perception of him. Her smile remained as reserved and professional as always, though something in her eyes suggested new understanding. "Those men you dealt with last night?" she said, falling into step beside him without invitation, her medical bag swinging lightly at her side. "They'll recover, though one has a dislocated shoulder that will never quite sit right again." When Ezra didn't respond, she continued, undeterred. "Never seen joint manipulations quite like that. Clean, precise, almost surgical." She studied his profile carefully. "A man doesn't learn techniques like that working cattle or mining silver, Deputy Blackwood." Ezra kept walking, his eyes fixed ahead, but Dr. Finch wasn't finished. "During the war, I volunteered at a military hospital in Maryland," she said, her voice taking on a different quality. "After Antietam, they brought in Confederate prisoners, men who'd survived an encounter with a Union scout. Their injuries were distinctive, disabling rather than fatal when possible, applied with almost mathematical precision." She paused, meaningfully. Some of the officers whispered about a ghost who moved without sound, a specialist deployed when the army needed problems solved without bullets. A man who could kill with his hands in ways that left no traces. Ezra stopped, turning to face her fully for perhaps the first time since they'd met months ago. His grey eyes, usually downcast, met hers directly. "Those men recovered too," he said quietly. It wasn't a denial. Dr. Finch nodded slowly. "Whatever you're running from, Timber Creek could use someone with your particular skills, especially now." She glanced back toward her clinic, where patients were already beginning to gather. "Hastings has been bleeding this territory dry for years. Jenkins is a good man, but he's getting old." She turned to leave, then hesitated. "Just one more thing, Deputy. Those techniques you used last night, they're not meant for barroom brawls. They're designed to disable enemy combatants, efficiently, permanently if necessary." Her eyes held his. "Whoever taught you was creating a weapon, not a peacekeeper." As she walked away, Ezra stood motionless, her words stirring memories he'd fought to suppress. She was right, of course. Major William Hammond hadn't been interested in creating peacekeepers when he'd selected 30 men from across the Union Army for his special project. He'd wanted living weapons, soldiers who could move unseen, fight without weapons when necessary, and leave no witnesses when required. Brief flashback. A younger Ezra in a Union uniform standing at attention while a stern officer paces before him. "War demands terrible things of men," Hammond had told them on the first day of training, but it demands even more terrible things of the few who possess the abilities we've identified in you. You will become ghosts, men who can slip behind enemy lines, gather intelligence, eliminate threats, and vanish without a trace. Return to present. Marshal Jenkins was waiting in his office, boots propped on his desk, a cup of coffee cooling beside him as he read through wanted posters with squinted eyes. The years hadn't been kind to Jenkins. Decades of frontier law enforcement had left their mark in the stiffness of his movements and the permanent creases around his eyes. But his mind remained sharp as the hunting knife at his belt. "Shut the door, Ezra," he ordered without looking up. As Ezra complied, Jenkins finally raised his eyes, setting aside the posters with deliberate care. The morning light streaming through dust-mottled windows cast harsh shadows across his weathered face. "Got word from Sheriff Davis down in Dry Gulch this morning," Jenkins said, his voice carrying the gravelly quality of a man who'd spent too many years shouting over gunfire. "Hastings himself was spotted crossing into our county yesterday, with about a dozen riders." He paused, measuring his next words carefully. "Word is, he's carrying a heavily modified Lamat revolver, 9 shots with a shotgun barrel underneath." Ezra gave a single nod, absorbing this information with the calm assessment of a man accustomed to calculating odds. "That's not all," Jenkins continued, dropping his boots to the floor with a thud that scattered dust motes in the sunbeam. "Army sent a wire asking about you specifically." He pulled open his desk drawer and withdrew a yellow telegram, sliding it across the scarred wooden surface. "Seems someone's mighty interested in a man fitting your description, someone with enough authority to have the army asking questions." Ezra picked up the telegram, reading it with the careful attention he gave all potential threats. The message was carefully worded, but its implications were clear. The military was looking for a specialist believed killed during a classified operation 5 years earlier. "You want to tell me who's hunting you, son?" Jenkins asked, his tone making it clear the question wasn't merely idle curiosity. Ezra folded the telegram precisely, setting it back on the desk before meeting Jenkins's gaze. "After the war," he said, his voice so quiet Jenkins had to lean forward to hear. "The army kept certain units active for specialized work, operations too delicate or too morally ambiguous for regular forces." Jenkins nodded slowly. "Ghost units. Heard rumors, never put much stock in them." His eyes narrowed. "Until a man walked into my town who moved like no one I've ever seen. 5 years ago, something went wrong. A mission in Arizona territory against a band of renegades who'd been raiding settlements." Ezra's eyes grew distant. "We were told they were Apache, given intelligence about their camp locations, family structures, defensive positions. But when we infiltrated their main camp, we found civilians, Mexican families who'd fled north to escape the chaos in Sonora." He paused, the memory visibly painful. "My commanding officer, Colonel Thorne, ordered us to eliminate all witnesses regardless. Said the mission parameters hadn't changed." His hands, normally so still, clenched slightly. "I refused. Some of my units sided with me, others with Thorne. By dawn, the camp was burning and I was the only one walking away." "The army doesn't like loose ends," Jenkins observed quietly. "No," Ezra agreed. "Official records list me as killed during the operation. Thorne made sure of that. But unofficially, he left the thought unfinished. And now they've found you." Jenkins' statement required no confirmation. The question is how. Ezra's eyes focused once more, sharp and analytical. "And why now, after 5 years?" Jenkins rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Might have something to do with the new command at Fort Brennan. Colonel arrived last month, real political type with connections back east. Name's Hammond." Ezra went very still. "William Hammond? That's the one. Know him? He created the program that trained me." Ezra's voice had gone flat. "If Hammond's nearby, this isn't coincidence." Jenkins cursed under his breath. "So we've got Hastings coming to settle a score, the army looking for a ghost, and Hammond pulling strings for reasons unknown." He shook his head grimly. "Sounds like the perfect storm." "I should leave," Ezra said, already calculating routes, supplies needed, potential safe havens farther west. "And go where?" Jenkins challenged. "You've been running 5 years, son. How's that working out for you?" He gestured toward the window, where Timber Creek's main street was visible. "Besides, this town needs you. Hastings has been bleeding these people dry for too long." Before Ezra could respond, the door burst open as Deputy Taylor rushed in, his youthful face flushed with alarm. "Marshal! Riders coming in from the south, at least 10 of them." Jenkins rose with a grunt of effort, reaching for the shotgun mounted on the wall behind his desk. "Hastings? No, sir," Taylor replied, his voice tight with tension. "Army patrol, led by a colonel." Jenkins and Ezra exchanged a look of understanding. The storm had arrived sooner than expected, and from an unexpected direction. "You got a choice to make, and fast," Jenkins said quietly. "Run again or stand your ground. Either way, I'll back your play." He patted the shotgun meaningfully. "Timber Creek takes care of its own." For a long moment, Ezra stood motionless, weighing options, calculating risks, considering scenarios as he'd been trained to do. Then with deliberate movements he unbuckled his gun belt and placed it on Jenkins's desk. "If I'm carrying when Hammond arrives, he'll have cause to arrest me immediately," he explained. "But if I appear to be an unarmed deputy—" He left the strategic advantage unspoken. Jenkins nodded approvingly. "Smart play. Taylor, go tell Dr. Finch we may need her services soon. Then get back here, fast." As Taylor hurried out, Ezra moved to the window, positioning himself to observe the approaching riders without being easily seen. 10 soldiers in Union blue, riding in formation around a central figure on a black stallion. Even at this distance, Colonel William Hammond's rigid posture and precisely angled hat were unmistakable. "One more thing you should know, Marshal," Ezra said, his eyes never leaving the approaching threat. "If Hammond's here personally, he's not planning to arrest me." He turned, meeting Jenkins's gaze with unflinching directness. "He's planning to eliminate any evidence that his program ever existed, including me, anyone who knows about me, and possibly this entire town, if necessary." Jenkins processed this with the stoic acceptance of a man who'd faced death many times before. "Then we better make sure that doesn't happen." He checked his shotgun methodically. "Any suggestions how we handle a man willing to wipe a town off the map?" A cold smile ghosted across Ezra's face, an expression so at odds with his usual careful blankness that it transformed him completely. "As it happens, Marshal, Colonel Hammond taught me everything I know about eliminating problems efficiently." He turned back to the window, tracking the soldier's approach with calculating eyes. Perhaps it's time he learned how well his lessons took. Outside, the thunder that had been threatening all morning finally broke, a jagged bolt of lightning, splitting the sky as the first heavy raindrops began to fall. Colonel Hammond halted his patrol at the edge of town, his imperious gaze sweeping Timber Creek's modest buildings as if assessing their value and finding them wanting. Inside the marshal's office, Ezra Blackwood waited with the patient stillness of a predator, watching as the man who had created him then tried to destroy him, prepared to make his approach. The ghost he'd tried so hard not to be was stirring once more, answering the call of approaching danger. The storm had arrived in Timber Creek, and before it passed, blood would soak the thirsty ground alongside the rain. The rain fell in sheets across Timber Creek, transforming the dusty main street into channels of flowing mud. Lightning scarred the sky at irregular intervals, briefly illuminating the town in stark relief before plunging it back into the premature darkness of the storm. If the locals recognized this as an omen, None spoke it aloud, though many whispered prayers behind locked doors as two forces converged on their forgotten corner of the frontier. Colonel William Hammond dismounted with military precision, handing his reins to a subordinate without taking his eyes off the marshal's office. At 52, Hammond remained as imposing as he had been during the war. Ramrod straight, immaculately uniformed despite the journey, his salt and pepper beard trimmed to regulation perfection. The silver eagle insignia on his uniform gleamed despite the absence of sunlight, polished to a mirror shine that matched the cold calculation in his eyes. Sergeant Reynolds, he addressed the weathered non-commissioned officer at his side, without turning, secure the perimeter. No one enters or leaves this town without my express permission. Yes, sir. Reynolds responded with practiced efficiency, immediately signaling to the patrol to take up positions at strategic points throughout Timber Creek. Hammond straightened his already impeccable uniform and strode toward the marshal's office, spurs jingling with each deliberate step. The few townsfolk brave enough to remain on the street scattered before him, recognizing the implacable authority that radiated from him like heat from a forge. Inside the marshal's office, Jenkins positioned himself behind his desk, shotgun visible but not directly threatening. Ezra had moved to the small alcove where wanted posters were catalogued, partially hidden in shadow but with clear sightlines to both the door and the street-facing windows. His posture appeared relaxed to casual observation, but Jenkins recognized the coiled readiness beneath the stillness, a predator perfectly positioned to strike. The door swung open with theatrical timing as thunder cracked overhead. Hammond entered without knocking, water streaming from his oiled cavalry cloak, his presence immediately dominating the modest room. Two soldiers flanked him, hands resting on holstered revolvers, eyes scanning for threats. Marshal Jenkins. Presume, Hammond said, his voice carrying the precise diction of formal education layered over Virginia roots. He did not extend his hand. Colonel, Jenkins acknowledged with deliberate casualness. What brings the army to our little town? Indian troubles are 2 counties over. Hammond's smile never reached his eyes. I'm conducting a manhunt, Marshal. A dangerous fugitive believed to be in this area. He reached into his uniform jacket and withdrew a folded document bearing an official seal. I have authorization to deputize your office in this pursuit, signed by the territorial governor himself. Jenkins made no move to accept the document. My jurisdiction, my rules, Colonel. Who exactly are you hunting? Hammond's gaze finally shifted, focusing with laser intensity on the shadowed figure in the alcove. A ghost, Marshal. One that should have stayed dead. Ezra stepped forward into the light, his face betraying nothing as he met the colonel's stare. For a charged moment, the two men regarded each other in silence. Former mentor and protege, creator and creation, now adversaries in a game where the stakes extended far beyond personal vendetta. Ezra Blackwood, Hammond pronounced the name with peculiar emphasis. Although that's not the name you were using when you deserted your post and murdered your fellow soldiers, is it? Is that the story you're telling now, Colonel? Ezra's voice remained soft, but something dangerous lurked beneath its calm surface. Strange how the official record lists me as killed in action. Hammond waved this away as if swatting an insignificant insect. Administrative error, one I've come to correct personally. Jenkins cleared his throat. Seems to me any crimes committed under military authority would fall under military jurisdiction, Colonel. Yet you haven't shown me any official warrants or transfer papers, just a vague authorization to assist in a manhunt. The papers regarding this man are classified at the highest levels, Hammond replied, his tone sharpening. But make no mistake, Marshal. This man is a deserter and a murderer. He betrayed his unit and his country. I betrayed an illegal order, Ezra corrected quietly. And the only men I killed were those who chose to massacre civilians rather than disobey that order. Hammond's face darkened. You were a soldier. Soldiers follow orders. We were more than soldiers, Ezra countered. Your own words, Colonel. Special operators transcend conventional military parameters. You created us to use judgment in the field. Not to judge your superior officers, Hammond snapped, the first crack appearing in his controlled demeanor. Jenkins watched this exchange with growing understanding. So that's what this is about. Not justice, control. Your man here made a moral choice you didn't approve of, and now you're covering your tracks. Hammond's attention swiveled back to Jenkins, reassessing the aging lawman with new respect and greater wariness. You have no idea what you're involving yourself in, Marshal. This goes far beyond your little town. Maybe so, Jenkins agreed amiably, though his eyes had hardened. But this man wears my deputy's badge, which makes him my concern. He finally picked up the authorization Hammond had placed on his desk, examining it briefly before tossing it aside. This paper gives you the right to request assistance, Colonel. It doesn't authorize you to take one of my deputies into custody without proper documentation. Hammond's hand moved subtly toward his sidearm. I don't think you understand the gravity, the metallic click of a revolver's hammer being cocked. Interrupted him. Deputy Taylor stood in the doorway, his weapon trained steadily on Hammond's back. I understand just fine, Jenkins said, rising slowly from his chair. Seem to recall there are procedures for military personnel operating in civilian jurisdictions. Papers need filing, charges need documenting. His smile was all teeth. Bureaucracy's a real bear, ain't it, Colonel? Hammond's eyes narrowed as he calculated his options. The two soldiers who had accompanied him tensed, awaiting orders, but with Taylor's gun at their commander's back, the situation had reached a precarious stalemate. 24 hours, Hammond said finally. I'll have the proper documentation. Within 24 hours. In the meantime, I expect this man to remain in Timber Creek under your personal supervision. He's my deputy, Jenkins replied evenly. Where else would he be? As Hammond turned to leave, his gaze locked once more. With Ezra's, this isn't over. It never was. On that we agree, Ezra responded, his voice carrying a quiet finality that made even the hardened colonel pause momentarily. Once Hammond and his soldiers had departed, Jenkins slumped back into his chair with a long exhale. Well, that bought us some time, but not much. Hammond strikes me as the type who creates paperwork when he can't find it. He won't wait 24 hours, Ezra confirmed, moving to the window to observe Hammond conferring with Sergeant Reynolds across the street. He'll move tonight under cover of the storm. Taylor holstered his weapon, hands shaking slightly with the aftermath of tension. So what's the plan? Jenkins and Ezra exchanged a look filled with unspoken calculation. We need allies, Jenkins decided. Taylor, find Dr. Finch. Her word carries weight with the town council, and get Josephine from the saloon. She knows everyone worth knowing in 3 counties. As Taylor hurried out, Jenkins turned to Ezra. Hammond wasn't just your commanding officer, was he? This feels personal. Ezra's gaze remained fixed on the street, where Hammond was now dispatching riders in different directions. He recruited me personally after Antietam, said I had unique potential, spent 2 years molding me into his perfect operative. His expression hardened. Then he sent me to murder women and children and expected me to follow orders without question. Men like that don't forgive betrayal, Jenkins observed. This isn't about forgiveness, Ezra replied. It's about silencing witnesses. Hammond's being considered for a generalship. The Arizona massacre would end his career if it came to light. A commotion from the south end of town interrupted their conversation. Raised voices, the clatter of multiple horses, shouts of alarm. Jenkins grabbed his shotgun as Ezra moved to the side window for a better view. Riders, Ezra reported tersely. At least 8, coming in fast. Jenkins cursed under his breath. Hastings, he checked his shotgun with practiced hands. Perfect. Timing. The storm had intensified, rain lashing the windows as Victor Hastings and his gang rode into Timber Creek like an invading army. Unlike Hammond's disciplined soldiers, the Hastings gang made no pretense of legitimacy. They rode hard down the main street, firing shots into the air, their leader's distinctive figure unmistakable even through the downpour. Victor Hastings was a large man, broad-shouldered and imposing, his face partially concealed by a thick black beard streaked with premature grey. The custom LeMat revolver Jenkins had mentioned hung prominently at his side, its distinctive profile marking it as the specialized killing tool it was. Flanking him rode his lieutenants, men chosen for brutality rather than intelligence, each with notches on their gun handles representing lives taken. As the gang reached the center of town, Hastings reined in sharply, surveying his surroundings with the calculating eye of a predator marking territory. The specialized LeMat swung in an arc as he gestured for his men to spread out. "Jenkins!" His voice boomed over the storm's fury. "Send out the man who hurt my boys!" Across the street, Hammond and his soldiers watched the developing situation with professional interest, making no move to intervene. The colonel's expression shifted from irritation at the interruption to calculating assessment as he observed. "This new dynamic seems your past and present are colliding, son," Jenkins remarked grimly. Ezra nodded once. "Hammond won't interfere. He'll let Hastings do his dirty work, then clean up afterward." "Two birds, one stone," Jenkins agreed. "Question is, what's our play?" Ezra's eyes narrowed as he analyzed the tactical situation. Hastings' men were spreading out, taking positions that would allow them to control the main approaches to the marshal's office. Hammond's soldiers had withdrawn to the periphery, maintaining observation positions without directly engaging. The town's civilians had wisely disappeared indoors, leaving the streets to the opposing forces. "We're outnumbered and outgunned," Jenkins continued, "and caught between two enemies who'd both happily see us dead." "Not necessarily," Ezra replied, his voice taking on the precise quality it adopted when tactical calculations replaced emotion. "Hammond and Hastings have different objectives. Hammond wants me silenced permanently, with minimal attention. Hastings wants public revenge for his wounded pride." His eyes tracked the continuing deployment of Hastings's men. "Their methods are incompatible." A slow smile spread across Jenkins' weathered face as understanding dawned. "You're thinking we play them against each other?" Before Ezra could respond, the front door burst open as Dr. Eleanor Finch strode in, soaked to the skin but carrying herself with fierce determination. Behind her came Josephine Harding, a shotgun cradled in her capable hands. "Taylor's securing the back exit," Eleanor reported briskly, shaking water from her medical bag. "Told me what's happening. Two hostile forces both wanting our deputy here." She fixed Ezra with a penetrating stare. "Care to explain why half the territory suddenly has an interest in a man who supposedly doesn't exist?" "Later," Jenkins interjected. "Right now, we need options." Josephine moved to the window, assessing the situation with the practiced eye of a woman who'd survived frontier hardships that had broken stronger souls. "Town's caught in the middle of whatever this is. Innocent people will get hurt." "Not if we direct the violence away from them," Ezra said quietly. Eleanor's expression sharpened with sudden understanding. "You're planning to offer yourself as bait." "Not exactly," Ezra corrected. "I'm planning to ensure these two threats eliminate each other." Jenkins shook his head. "Hammond's too smart to fall for an obvious trap." "He is," Ezra agreed. "But there's one thing Hammond values above all else: control of information. If he believes I'm about to expose the Arizona operation to Hastings, he'll be forced to act immediately." "And Hastings," Josephine asked. "Wants public vengeance more than anything," Ezra replied. If he believes Hammond is trying to deny him that satisfaction, he'll turn his attention to the colonel. Eleanor regarded him with newfound respect, tinged with wariness. You're manipulating them both. I was trained by the best, Ezra replied without irony. Outside, Hastings' patience had reached its limit. A shot rang out, shattering the window of the general store across the street. 1 minute, Jenkins, the outlaw leader bellowed. Then we start burning this town down. Jenkins looked to Ezra, a silent question in his eyes. I need 5 minutes, Ezra said, already moving toward the back door. Keep Hastings talking, but don't antagonize him. And Hammond? Jenkins asked. Make sure he sees me leaving, Ezra instructed, but not where I'm going. As Ezra slipped out the back door into the driving rain, Jenkins moved to the front entrance, shotgun held non-threateningly at his side. Eleanor and Josephine positioned themselves at opposite windows, watching tensely as the marshal stepped onto the boardwalk. Hastings, Jenkins called, his voice carrying authority despite the storm. This is a civilized town. We handle matters according to law here. Across the street, Hammond's attention had shifted. Through the rain-streaked window of the hotel, he caught a glimpse of movement as Ezra circled behind the line of buildings. The colonel's eyes narrowed, and with a sharp gesture, he dispatched 2 soldiers to follow. In the shadows between buildings, Ezra moved with practiced stealth, his steps silent despite the mud and standing water. The rain provided perfect cover, obscuring visibility and masking sounds as he made his way toward the livery stable at the edge of town. Behind him, Hammond's soldiers struggled to maintain visual contact, their military training inadequate for tracking a ghost who didn't wish to be seen. Inside the stable, Ezra found young Deputy Taylor nervously checking his revolver. They're coming, Taylor reported, nodding toward the street. Hammond's men from the north, 2 of Hastings's boys from the south. Good, Ezra replied, surprising the younger man. I need you to make sure they see each other, then get clear. Understanding dawned on Taylor's face. You're setting them against each other. Ezra nodded once. When the shooting starts, it needs to happen away from the civilians. He glanced around the stable, quickly assessing angles, cover, potential escape routes. This place is remote enough to contain the damage. What about you? Taylor asked. I'll be fine, Ezra assured him, though both men recognized the evasion. Just make sure Hammond's men believe I'm meeting with Hastings' lieutenants. Taylor hesitated, then extended his hand. Been an honor serving with you, even if it was brief. Ezra regarded the offered hand with momentary surprise before accepting it with a firm grip. Keep the town safe, Deputy, that's what matters. As Taylor slipped out into the rain, Ezra positioned himself in the shadows of the hayloft, watching as Hammond's soldiers cautiously approached from one direction, while Hastings's men converged from another. The pieces were moving into position, the trap nearly set. The first shot came from Hastings' lieutenant, a warning fired when he spotted the army uniforms approaching through the downpour. Hammond's men returned fire immediately, military discipline translating into accurate shooting. Despite the poor conditions, within moments, the stable yard had erupted into a chaotic exchange of gunfire. From his vantage point, Ezra watched as Taylor successfully disengaged, circling back toward town to report the developing situation. Phase 1 of his improvised plan was underway. The first skirmish between Hammond's forces and Hastings's gang had begun. Now he needed to ensure the conflict escalated to include both leaders. Across town, the sound of distant gunfire reached Jenkins and Hammond simultaneously. The marshal maintained his position, keeping Hastings' attention focused on him, while Hammond's head snapped toward the sound with predatory alertness. "Seems your boys found trouble, Colonel," Jenkins observed mildly. Hammond's expression darkened. "What game is your deputy playing, Marshal?" "No game," Jenkins replied. "Just a man tired of running." Hammond studied Jenkins' face, then made a swift decision. Gesturing to his remaining men, he mounted his horse and set off toward the gunfire, leaving only 2 soldiers to maintain position in the town center. Hastings, no fool despite his brutal reputation, recognized the military commander's sudden departure as significant. "What's happening, Jenkins?" he demanded. The specialized Lamat now pointed directly at the marshal. "Appears your boys in the army are getting acquainted," Jenkins replied with deceptive calm. "Question is, what are you going to do about it?" Hastings' eyes narrowed beneath the brim of his rain-soaked hat. "The quiet deputy," he said with sudden understanding. "The one who broke my men. The army wants him too." Jenkins shrugged noncommittally. "Seems everyone wants a piece of Ezra Blackwood today." A calculating look crossed Hastings's bearded face. "Why?" "Man's got a past," Jenkins allowed. "One that some powerful people would prefer stayed buried." Hastings processed this information with surprising quickness, his brutal intelligence assessing the potential advantage in this unexpected development. With a sharp whistle, he summoned his remaining men. "Keep the marshal here," he ordered one of his lieutenants. "The rest of you with me." As Hastings and the majority of his gang rode toward the escalating gunfight, Josephine moved to Jenkins's side, shotgun at the ready. "Think. Your deputy knows what he's doing?" she asked quietly. Jenkins watched the outlaw leader disappear into the curtain of rain. "I surely hope so, Miss Josephine, for all our sakes." At the livery stable, the initial skirmish had intensified. 2 of Hastings's men were down, 1 dead and 1 wounded, while one of Hammond's soldiers nursed a bullet graze to his shoulder. The opposing forces had taken cover behind water troughs, wagons, and the corner of the stable, exchanging intermittent fire as the storm continued to rage around them. From his concealed position, Ezra observed Hammond's arrival with grim satisfaction. The colonel approached cautiously, keeping to cover, his sidearm drawn as he assessed the tactical situation. Moments later, Hastings and his reinforcements appeared from the opposite direction, immediately joining the firefight with enthusiastic brutality. The moment had come. With silent efficiency, Ezra descended from the hayloft and slipped out the back of the stable. His plan was in motion. Hammond and Hastings were now directly engaged with each other, their forces committed to a conflict neither had anticipated. All that remained was to ensure the violence remained contained and directed away from innocent bystanders. As he circled through the driving rain toward higher ground that would give him a better vantage point, Ezra reflected that Timber Creek had offered him something he hadn't experienced in years, a community worth protecting, people whose lives mattered beyond tactical calculations. For the first time since Arizona, he found himself fighting for something rather than against someone. The ghost was still a weapon, but perhaps at last he had found the right battle to fight. The storm had reached its full fury over Timber Creek, the downpour transforming gentle streams into raging torrents and flooding the lower sections of town. Nature's violence provided a fitting backdrop to the man-made chaos unfolding at the livery stable, where 2 forces, each deadly in their own right, had become locked in unexpected combat. Lightning split the sky, briefly illuminating the battlefield, where Hammond's disciplined soldiers exchanged fire with Hastings's more numerous but less organized gang. The tactical situation had quickly deteriorated into the kind of confused, close-quarters fight where training battled against savagery, and luck often determined survival. 2 more of Hastings's men lay motionless in the mud, while one of Hammond's soldiers clutched a blooming red stain on his chest, his eyes already growing distant. From his elevated position atop the adjacent grain storage building, Ezra observed the confrontation with clinical detachment, assessing strengths, weaknesses, and the evolving dynamics of the encounter. Hammond had established a defensive perimeter using wagons and water troughs, maximizing his men's superior marksmanship, while minimizing exposure. Hastings, conversely, relied on aggressive maneuvering and overwhelming firepower, his men constantly shifting positions to prevent Hammond's forces from concentrating their fire. Neither side yet realized they were performing according to a script, written by the man they had both come to Timber Creek to capture or kill. Colonel Hammond crouched behind an overturned wagon, his service revolver held with practiced precision as he directed his men with hand signals honed through decades of military command. Despite the chaotic conditions, he maintained the rigid self-control that had defined his career until his gaze locked onto a shadowy figure watching from the rooftop. Even through the rain and gloom, Hammond recognized the silhouette, the distinctive posture, the predatory stillness that his program had spent years perfecting. For a brief moment, mentor and protégé regarded each other across the battlefield, and something like grudging professional respect flickered across Hammond's weathered features before being replaced by cold determination. Hastings, meanwhile, had broken from his men to circle behind the stable, seeking a flanking position that would allow him to bring his fearsome Lammat to bear on Hammond's exposed position. The outlaw leader moved with surprising stealth for a man of his size, keeping to the shadows as he navigated the treacherous footing. When he glimpsed a figure on the rooftop, his initial impulse was to fire, until recognition dawned, followed by a wolfish grin that disappeared into his sodden beard. The pieces were in motion, the trap nearly complete. Ezra had successfully drawn both his pursuers away from the town center and into conflict with each other. Now came the delicate task of ensuring that conflict reached its logical conclusion without endangering the people of Timber Creek. He descended from his perch with silent efficiency, dropping into the shadows behind the stable, just as Hastings reached the same position. The outlaw leader froze, the specialized Lammat swinging toward the unexpected movement before recognition stayed his trigger finger. "You're the quiet deputy," Hastings growled, rain streaming down his face and into his beard. "The one who broke my boys." Ezra made no move toward his weapons, maintaining a careful distance from the volatile gang leader. "Your boys touched what? Wasn't theirs," he replied, his voice almost lost beneath the storm's fury. "They paid the price." Hastings' eyes narrowed, assessing this unusual adversary with predatory calculation. "Army wants you bad," he observed. "Man must be worth something to bring a colonel out in weather like this. I have information Hammond would kill to keep." "Buried," Ezra confirmed, feeding the outlaw's growing interest, "about operations that would hang him if they came to light." Hastings processed this, the brutal intelligence behind his savage exterior, recognizing the potential value in such knowledge. "What's stopping me from killing you now and trading your corpse to the colonel for safe passage through this territory?" "Because Hammond doesn't want me captured," Ezra replied evenly. "He wants me erased, along with anyone who might have spoken with me." Understanding dawned in Hastings's eyes, followed swiftly by the kind of murderous anger that had made his name feared across 3 territories. "Son of a bitch was planning to clean up after himself," he snarled. "Take me out once I'd done his dirty work." Ezra neither confirmed nor denied, allowing Hastings' own paranoia to fill in the blanks. The gambit was working. The outlaw's focus had shifted from Ezra to Hammond, redirecting his considerable capacity for violence toward a more deserving target. "The colonel has 7 men," Ezra offered, as if providing tactical assistance. 2 are wounded. They're running low on ammunition after the initial exchange. Hastings' grip tightened on the Lammat, his decision already made. "He'll run lower still before I'm done." He turned to go, then paused, regarding Ezra with reluctant Curiosity. They call you the ghost in some circles. That true? Ezra's silence was answer enough. A bark of laughter escaped Hastings. Thought that was just trail talk. Man who can kill with his bare hands moves like a shadow. He shook his head. After this is done, you and me got unfinished business. Nobody touches my men without answering to Victor Hastings. After this is done, Ezra echoed, neither agreement nor challenge in his tone. As Hastings moved away to rejoin his men, now with Hammond firmly established as his primary target, Ezra circled in the opposite direction. The confrontation was escalating exactly as he had planned, but the danger was far from past. Hammond was too experienced, too calculating to be caught in a simple trap. The colonel would have contingencies, and Ezra needed to be prepared for them. Back in town, Marshal Jenkins maintained an uneasy standoff with the Hastings gang member left behind to guard him. The outlaw kept his revolver trained on Jenkins from across the street, sheltering beneath the overhang of the general store, while the marshal remained on the boardwalk outside his office. "You hear that?" Jenkins called through the downpour, nodding toward the distant sound of gunfire. "Your boss just rode into something bigger than he expected." The gang member shifted nervously, clearly torn between his orders to watch Jenkins and his instinct to rejoin his companions. "Shut your mouth, old man." Dr. Eleanor Finch appeared at Jenkins's side, her medical bag in hand. "Those shots mean wounded men," she said calmly. "I should go to them." The outlaw's gun swung toward her. "Nobody's going nowhere." "Son," Jenkins said with deceptive mildness, "you really want to explain to Hastings why you prevented a doctor from saving his men?" Uncertainty flickered across the young outlaw's face, his inexperience showing through his attempt at menace. "Do you stay put, both of you?" Eleanor sighed impatiently. "People are dying while we debate. Your loyalty is admirable, but surely your leader would want his men treated." The gang member wavered visibly, his resolve crumbling beneath the combined weight of the doctor's moral authority and Jenkins's implied threat of Hastings' displeasure. "Fine," he conceded finally, "but I'm coming with you, and this old law dog stays here with my partner." He gestured toward another gang member emerging from the saloon. Jenkins nodded agreeably. "Sounds reasonable, though you might want to hurry. Gunfires intensifying." As Eleanor departed toward the livery stable with her reluctant escort, Josephine emerged from the marshal's office, shotgun held casually but ready. "Think she'll be safe?" she asked quietly. "Eleanor can handle herself," Jenkins replied with more confidence than he felt. "Besides, we've got our own problems to worry about." He nodded toward the second gang member approaching through the rain. "One problem at a time," Josephine agreed, her grip tightening on the shotgun. "Just like Ezra would say, at the livery stable." The confrontation had evolved into a deadly game of cat and mouse, with Hammond's disciplined forces holding defensive positions while Hastings' more numerous gang attempted to flush them out. The building itself had become collateral damage, its wooden walls splintered by bullets, its interior illuminated by muzzle flashes that briefly revealed men crouching, running, dying in the confined space. Hammond had recognized the strategic disadvantage his position represented. With ammunition running low and his force depleted by casualties, the logical military decision was to withdraw and regroup. But this mission had ceased to be about military logic the moment he had spotted Ezra observing the battle. This was now personal, a matter of tying off loose ends from an operation that could destroy everything Hammond had built if it came to light. "Sergeant Reynolds," Hammond called to his second-in-command, "establish a fallback position. We're being flanked." Reynolds, a veteran of numerous frontier conflicts, recognized the tactical wisdom in the order but hesitated. "What about the target, sir?" Hammond's expression hardened. "Leave Blackwood to me. Your priority is neutralizing these outlaws." He checked his service revolver methodically. "And Reynolds, no witnesses. The official report will show we engaged hostile forces threatening civilian safety." Understanding dawned in the sergeant's eyes. This was to be a clean-up operation, with all evidence of Hammond's true purpose eliminated. "Yes, sir. Understood." As Reynolds directed the remaining soldiers in a fighting retreat toward more defensible positions, Hammond separated from the group, moving deeper into the damaged stable with the instincts of a predator seeking specific prey. Rain dripped through new holes in the roof, creating a chaotic pattern of shadows and reflections that would challenge a normal man's perception. But Hammond had not survived decades of frontier warfare by being normal. His senses were honed to detect the subtlest indications of threat. He found Ezra waiting in the tack room, as still as the saddles hanging on the walls around him, his face half illuminated by a lantern swinging gently from a roof beam. "I trained you better than this," Hammond said, revolver leveled at his former operative's chest. "Allowing yourself to be cornered is a beginner's mistake." "Who says I'm cornered?" Ezra replied, his voice carrying that same quiet certainty that had always unsettled Hammond, even during training. Hammond's laugh held no humor. "Always the chess player, even now. You've maneuvered Hastings and me into conflict, drawn us away from the town. Very neat, very predictable. Yet here you are," Ezra observed mildly, "because some loose ends need to be tied personally." Hammond's finger tightened imperceptibly on the trigger. "You know too much, Ezra, about Arizona, about Project Phantom, about operations that never officially existed, and killing me solves that problem. It's a start." Hammond's eyes were cold, calculating. "The rest will be managed through official channels, a tragic engagement with hostiles, multiple casualties, records sealed for national security." Ezra regarded his former commander with something like pity. "You really believe it will end here?" "I know it will," Hammond affirmed. "One way or another, the ghost of Antietam dies in Timber Creek." Outside, the gunfire had intensified, suggesting Hastings had launched a coordinated assault on Hammond's fallback position. The colonel's head turned slightly at a particularly close exchange, just enough distraction for Ezra to move, but Hammond hadn't survived this long by being easily ambushed. His revolver tracked Ezra's movement with precision, the shot deafening in the confined space. Ezra felt the bullet's passage like a whisper against his cheek as he closed the distance, leveraging Hammond's extended arm with a technique the colonel himself had taught him years before. The revolver clattered to the floor as Hammond countered, with a vicious strike to Ezra's throat, another move from their shared training. For a moment, they were locked in the deadly dance they had practiced countless times during the war, each anticipating the other's techniques, neither able to gain decisive advantage. "I made you what you are," Hammond grunted as they grappled, among fallen saddles and tack. "The perfect weapon." "You tried," Ezra acknowledged, redirecting Hammond's momentum to slam him against the wall. "But even you couldn't remove my conscience." Hammond's laugh was strained but genuine. "Conscience, is that what you call it?" He broke Ezra's hold with a veteran's determination, blood streaming from a cut above his eye. "You were the best of them, Ezra, the perfect balance of intellect and instinct. We could have reshaped the entire frontier through massacre and deception," Ezra replied, circling warily, "creating ghosts to haunt the survivors. We were bringing order to chaos." Hammond's control finally cracked, decades of justified atrocities, breaking through his disciplined facade. "You think this country was built by men with clean hands? The frontier doesn't recognize conscience, only strength and will." "Perhaps," Ezra conceded, his movements economical as he maintained tactical distance. "But I recognize the children in that camp." Hammond froze momentarily, genuine confusion crossing his features. "What are you talking about?" "Arizona," Ezra clarified. "The renegade camp. There were children, Hammond. Families seeking refuge. Collateral damage." Hammond dismissed, though something flickered in his eyes, not remorse but calculation. Regrettable, but necessary for the greater objective. What objective? Ezra pressed, suddenly certain he was approaching the truth. Hammond had killed to protect. That land had no strategic value, no resources worth securing. Hammond's smile was cold as he recovered his composure. Not in the conventional sense, no, but its location was perfect for what Senator Matthews required, a private route for his business interests, far from prying federal eyes. Understanding dawned. The operation wasn't military at all. You were clearing civilians for a private concern. The distinction is meaningless, Hammond replied with the conviction of a man who had long ago justified his choices. Private interests build nations, Ezra. Always have. Matthews provided the funding our unit needed when Congress threatened cuts. The revelation crystallized years of fragmented suspicions into a coherent pattern. Hammond hadn't been following military objectives in Arizona. He had been conducting private clearance operations disguised as security actions, using the specialized unit he had created as a personal enforcement tool for wealthy interests. How many other renegade camps were actually innocent civilians? Ezra asked quietly. Hammond's expression hardened. Enough philosophy. You may have orchestrated this little confrontation, but you've overlooked one crucial detail. He withdrew, a second smaller revolver from his boot, an old cavalryman's trick. I always have a contingency. Before Hammond could fire, the stable wall behind him exploded inward as Victor Hastings crashed through, blood streaming from a wound in his shoulder, but the massive Lamat revolver steady in his grip. Found you, you military bastard, Hastings snarled, momentarily ignoring Ezra as he focused on the man he now perceived as the greater threat. Thought you could use me to do your dirty work, then clean up afterward. Hammond recovered quickly, his training asserting itself as he shifted. To address this new threat. Mr. Hastings, I presume there seems to be a misunderstanding. Save it, Hastings cut him off. Your ghost here told me all about your plans. He gestured toward Ezra without taking his eyes off Hammond. Figured he might be lying, but then I heard your sergeant giving orders to eliminate all witnesses. Real enlightening. Hammond's expression revealed nothing, but Ezra noted the minute shift in his posture. The colonel was recalculating, adapting to this unexpected development with the tactical flexibility that had made him so dangerous. Mr. Hastings, Hammond tried again, his voice taking on the authoritative tone that had commanded men through decades of warfare. This man is manipulating us both. He's a deserter and a murderer with a personal vendetta. Don't much care, Hastings interrupted, the Lamat's distinctive profile unwavering. Way I see it, you're the bigger threat to my operation. Military involvement means federal attention. And that's bad for business. The standoff had reached its critical point. 3 men, each deadly in his own way, locked in a triangle of mutual threat within the confined space of the tack room. Outside, the gunfire had diminished, suggesting one side had gained the upper hand in the larger confrontation. The question of which side remained ominously unanswered. Seems we're at an impasse, Hammond observed coolly, his backup revolver held ready, but not directly threatening either man. Though I suspect an arrangement could be reached that would benefit us both, Mr. Hastings. I'm listening, Hastings replied, though the Lamat never wavered. Ezra watched this negotiation unfold with grim recognition. Hammond was doing what he had always excelled at, finding leverage, creating alliances of convenience, bending chaotic situations to his advantage. If the colonel succeeded in turning Hastings against their common enemy, Ezra's carefully constructed plan would collapse. The army has no inherent interest in your business ventures, Hammond continued smoothly. Our presence here relates solely to the apprehension of this man. Once that matter is resolved, I see no reason why mutually beneficial arrangements couldn't be established. What kind of arrangements? Hastings asked, suspicion evident in his tone, but also a calculating interest that suggested Hammond's approach was finding purchase. Military patrols can be scheduled with predictable regularity, Hammond explained. Routes can be chosen that avoid certain areas at certain times. Information about shipments or competitor activities might occasionally find its way to interested parties. His smile was professionally disarming. The frontier is vast, after all. Proper management of resources requires understanding with local stakeholders. Hastings considered this, the brutal pragmatism that had built his criminal empire, recognizing the potential value in such an arrangement. His grip on the Lamat relaxed fractionally. And what do you get out of this cozy relationship, Colonel? Operational efficiency, reduced conflict, and perhaps occasionally information about elements threatening territorial stability. Hammond's gaze flicked briefly to Ezra. Starting with the elimination of a shared problem, the moment hung suspended. The future of Timber Creek and its people balanced on the razor edge of Hastings's decision. Ezra had gambled everything on the outlaw's hatred for Hammond, outweighing his desire for personal revenge. But Hammond's offer threatened to shift that calculation. An interesting proposal, Hastings acknowledged finally. But there's one problem. With it, Hammond raised an eyebrow. And that is? I don't trust men who betray their own. Hastings's grip on the Lamat tightened once more. This ghost of yours might be my enemy, but at least he fights his own battles. You hide behind orders and arrangements, Colonel. Hammond's expression hardened. A disappointing lack of vision, Mr. Hastings. Maybe, Hastings agreed. But out, here on the frontier, a man's word and reputation are all he has. And from what I hear, yours ain't worth much. As the tension between the two men reached breaking point, a new complication emerged. Dr. Eleanor Finch appeared in the doorway, her medical bag clutched in one hand, her expression shifting rapidly. From professional determination to shock as she assessed the standoff before her. There are wounded men who need attention, she announced with the authority that had cowed even the most recalcitrant patients. Whatever this is, it can wait. Hammond recovered first, military discipline reasserting itself. Doctor, I must insist. You leave immediately. This is a dangerous— Shut up, Eleanor interrupted with surprising force. I've treated soldiers and outlaws alike for 15 years on this frontier. I'll decide what's dangerous. Her gaze swept the three men with clinical assessment. Now, are any of you actively bleeding, or can I attend to the men who are? The absurd normality of her question momentarily diffused the lethal tension in the room. Hastings actually chuckled, a sound like grinding stones. Lady's got sand, he observed with reluctant admiration. She does indeed, Hammond agreed, his tone suggesting newfound respect. Ezra alone recognized the strategic opportunity Eleanor had unwittingly provided, a momentary disruption that might allow him to resolve this confrontation without further bloodshed. With Hammond and Hastings both distracted by the doctor's unexpected appearance, he made his move. The world had narrowed to the space of a single room, a weathered tack room in a bullet-riddled stable on the edge of a frontier town. Few had ever heard of, yet within this humble space, forces that had shaped the violent history of the Western Territories converged like thunderheads, their collision inevitable and potentially devastating. The military precision of Hammond's ambition, the brutal pragmatism of Hastings's criminal empire, and the quiet, lethal skill of Ezra Blackwood. Three expressions of frontier power now trapped in a deadly triangle, each man's finger a hair's breadth from unleashing final judgment. Dr. Eleanor Finch stood framed in the doorway, her practical skirts muddied to the knee, medical bag clutched with white-knuckled determination. Her unexpected appearance had created a momentary distraction, a brief window of opportunity that Ezra recognized with the instinctive timing that had made him legendary during the war. In the split second that Hammond's and Hastings' attention shifted toward Eleanor, Ezra moved with the fluid grace that had earned him his spectral nickname. His right hand swept a coiled leather bullwhip from the wall beside him, a common enough tool in any stable, but in his hands, something far more dangerous. With a flick of his wrist almost too quick to follow, the whip unfurled like a striking serpent, its tip cracking precisely against Hammond's hand. The colonel's small backup revolver clattered to the ground as Hammond recoiled, more from surprise than pain. His military training asserted itself immediately as he lunged for the fallen weapon, but Ezra was already in motion, the whip dancing in complex patterns that kept both Hammond and Hastings at bay without directly threatening either. "Eleanor," Ezra said calmly, never taking his eyes off the two armed men, "back away slowly." The doctor hesitated, her professional instincts warring with self-preservation. "There are men dying out there," she protested, though she did take one cautious step backward. "And there will be more unless you clear the doorway," Ezra replied, his tone making it clear this was not a suggestion. Hammond had frozen in a half-crouch, his experienced eyes tracking the whip's movement with grudging professional respect. "Always adapting," he observed with the detached admiration of a craftsman appreciating another's work. "I taught you well." "You taught me techniques," Ezra corrected, the whip never ceasing its protective pattern, "not how to use them." Hastings, meanwhile, had shifted his position slightly, the massive Lamat now angled to cover both Ezra and Hammond. "Impressive parlor trick," the outlaw leader growled, "but a whip won't stop a bullet." "No," Ezra acknowledged, "but it can change. A bullet's course." To demonstrate, the whip's tip snapped within an inch of Hastings' trigger finger, not striking, but close enough to make the outlaw flinch involuntarily. "The problem facing both of you," Ezra continued conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather rather than engaged in a lethal standoff, "is that neither of you can eliminate the other without creating more problems than you solve." Hammond's eyes narrowed. "Explain. If you kill Hastings, his gang, currently engaged with your men outside, will have nothing to lose. They'll take as many of your soldiers with them as possible, attracting exactly the kind of attention you're trying to avoid." Ezra turned slightly, addressing the outlaw without breaking his rhythm. "And if you kill Hammond, Hastings, the army will hunt you relentlessly, not as a mere outlaw, but as the murderer of a decorated officer." "Seems to me," Hastings rumbled, "the simplest solution is for us both to kill you first, then sort out our differences." "You could try," Ezra agreed mildly, "but ask yourself why Hammond came personally to find me, rather than sending his men. Why he's so desperate to silence me that he's willing to eliminate an entire town if necessary." Hammond's jaw tightened, the only visible sign that Ezra's words had struck home. "You're bluffing, Blackwood. You have suspicions, not evidence." "I have the names of the civilians massacred at Rio Sombra," Ezra replied quietly. "I have the coordinates of 3 other renegade camps that mysteriously disappeared after your unit passed through. And I have the letter you sent to Senator Matthews confirming that the obstacles to his mining operation had been permanently addressed." The colonel's composure slipped momentarily, genuine shock replacing his calculated control. "How could you possibly? You taught me to gather intelligence before engaging a target," Ezra reminded him, "to prepare contingencies, to leave nothing to chance." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I learned those lessons well, Colonel." Hastings looked between the two men, his brutal intelligence processing this new information with surprising quickness. "Mining operation? You had your soldiers clearing civilians for some rich man's gold mine?" Disgust twisted his features. "And people call me an outlaw." "It was more complicated than that," Hammond insisted, regaining his composure. "Matthews provided funding when Congress threatened to disband our unit. The relationship was mutually beneficial. To everyone except the families your men slaughtered, Eleanor interjected from the doorway, where she had remained despite Ezra's warning. Her voice shook with barely controlled outrage. I treated survivors from Rio Sombra at the Mission Hospital in Santa Fe, children with burns covering half their bodies, women who'd watched their husbands executed for refusing to leave their homes. Hammond's face hardened. Regrettable casualties, but the expansion of American interests required— Don't, Ezra interrupted, the whip cracking sharply for emphasis. Don't hide behind patriotism or progress. What you did had nothing to do with America and everything to do with private profit. Outside, the gunfire had diminished to sporadic exchanges, suggesting the larger battle was reaching its conclusion. Through the broken wall, they could see that the storm was finally beginning to abate, the downpour softening to a steady rain as the first hints of dawn lightened the eastern sky. Time was running short for all of them. Here's what happens now, Ezra said with quiet authority. Dr. Finch will treat the wounded, all of them, regardless of which side they fought for. Hammond, you and your remaining men will withdraw from Timber Creek immediately. The evidence I've gathered stays secure as long as you stay away. And why would I agree to those terms? Hammond demanded, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Because the alternative is a military investigation into unauthorized operations, civilian casualties, and collaboration with private interests against federal policy. Ezra's eyes held Hammond's without wavering. Your career, your reputation, your freedom, all forfeit. Hammond processed this with the cold calculation that had defined his career, weighing options, assessing risks, considering contingencies. And Hastings, what's to prevent him from continuing his reign of terror once I withdraw? That's between him and Marshal Jenkins, Ezra replied. A local matter, to be handled locally. Hastings barked a harsh laugh. Convenient arrangement for you, Ghost. You get rid of the army breathing down your neck and leave me to face the town's law. The difference, Ezra observed, is that Jenkins will face you honorably, with proper charges and a fair trial. Hammond would have simply erased you once you'd served your purpose. The outlaw leader considered this, his expression unreadable beneath his sodden beard. And if I decide to eliminate the competition now— He gestured toward Hammond with the Lamat. Then his men will hunt you to the ends of the earth, Ezra said simply, and I'll help them. The threat hung in the air, its weight amplified by the quiet certainty with which it was delivered. Hastings studied Ezra's face, searching for weakness or deception, and finding neither. Finally, the outlaw lowered his weapon marginally. Never. Thought I'd walk away from a fight, he growled. But seems to me there's wisdom in living to fight another day. He fixed Hammond with a predatory stare. We'll settle accounts another time, Colonel. Hammond's smile was cold. I look forward to it, Mr. Hastings. Eleanor stepped forward, her professional demeanor reasserting itself now that immediate violence seemed less likely. If you gentlemen have finished posturing, I have patients to attend to. She fixed each man with the stern gaze that had cowed countless recalcitrant patients. I'll need assistance moving the wounded. The unlikely truce held as Eleanor directed the three men in establishing a makeshift field hospital in the main section of the stable. The casualties were significant. 3 of Hammond's soldiers dead, 2 more seriously wounded, 5 of Hastings's. Gang dead, with another 4 suffering various injuries. The survivors regarded each other with wary hostility, but the presence of their respective leaders and Ezra's watchful vigilance prevented further violence. As Eleanor worked tirelessly to stabilize the wounded, Hammond approached Ezra, who stood guard near the stable entrance. This changes nothing between us, the colonel said quietly, his voice pitched to reach Ezra alone. I've built too much to allow one rogue operative to destroy it all. I know, Ezra acknowledged, just as I know you'll honor our arrangement. Only until you find another way to eliminate me. Hammond studied his former protege with something like pride beneath his animosity. "We created the perfect weapon in you, Ezra. I only regret you turned that weapon against your creators." "You taught me to eliminate threats," Ezra replied simply. "What did you expect when you became one?" A thin smile crossed Hammond's weathered features. "A fair point." He glanced toward the town, now visible through the diminishing rain, as dawn brightened the eastern sky. "What will you do now? You can't stay here. Even if I withdraw, others will come." "I'll do what ghosts do," Ezra answered. "Disappear when the light comes." Hammond nodded slowly, accepting this as the most likely outcome. "The next time we meet, one of us won't walk away," Ezra finished for him. "I know." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Marshal Jenkins, Deputy Taylor, and Josephine, all three approaching cautiously with weapons ready. Jenkins took in the scene with the experienced eye of a frontier lawman, the wounded being. Treated, the uneasy truce between opposing forces and the central figure of Ezra maintaining order through his quiet authority. "Quite a mess you've made, Deputy," Jenkins observed dryly as he joined Ezra at the stable entrance. "Though I'm guessing it could have been worse." "Much worse," Ezra agreed. "Hammond and Hastings have both agreed to withdraw from Timber Creek. At least for now." Jenkins raised a skeptical eyebrow. "And you believe them?" "No," Ezra admitted, "but they believe me." Understanding dawned in Jenkins' weathered face. "You've got something on them. Something they fear more than each other." Ezra nodded once, watching as Hammond organized his remaining men to prepare for departure. Hammond fears exposure. Hastings fears federal intervention. Both will keep their distance as long as the threat remains credible. "And when it doesn't?" Jenkins asked quietly. "By then I'll be long gone," Ezra replied, his voice carrying a finality that brooked no argument. Jenkins regarded him with troubled eyes. "Running again, son? After all you've done for this town?" "Because of what I've done," Ezra corrected. Gently, "Timber Creek has seen enough violence. My presence will only bring more." Before Jenkins could respond, a commotion at the far end of the stable drew their attention. Hastings was engaged in a heated exchange with one of his wounded men, a wiry, vicious-looking individual whose bandaged shoulder hadn't dampened his aggressive demeanor. "I'm telling you, boss," the man was insisting, loud enough for his voice to carry. "I recognized him from the wanted circular. That's him, the one they called the Butcher of Bald Mountain. 50,000 federal reward." Hastings glanced toward Ezra, new calculation evident in his eyes. "You sure, Carson? That's serious money." "Stared at that circular for months," Carson confirmed, his pained expression giving way to greedy anticipation. "It's him, all right, the ghost. Wanted for the massacre of that mining camp up in Montana territory." Ezra went very still, his face revealing nothing, though Jenkins noted how his hand moved incrementally closer to his concealed knife. "That true?" Jenkins asked quietly, not wanting others to overhear. "You responsible for Bald Mountain?" "No," Ezra replied, his voice flat. "But Hammond is." Understanding dawned in Jenkins's eyes. "He framed you, made you the scapegoat for another of his operations." Across the stable, Hammond was watching the exchange between Hastings and Carson with careful neutrality, though the slight tension in his posture suggested heightened alertness, the perfect solution to his problem, Ezra confirmed. A rogue operative, already believed dead, takes the blame for a massacre conducted to clear a valuable mining claim for private interests. No connection to Hammond or his unit. Jenkins cursed softly. "That changes things. If Hastings thinks he can claim that reward, he'll never let me leave alive." Ezra finished for him. "Neither will Hammond, now that he knows I'm aware of the frame." The uneasy truce that had held through the dawn was evaporating like morning mist beneath the strengthening sun. Hastings conferred with his ambulatory men, their expressions shifting from exhaustion to predatory interest as the prospect of reward. Money outweighed their previous caution. Hammond, meanwhile, had positioned his soldiers to control the stable's main exit, his experienced eye recognizing the changing tactical situation. Eleanor approached, wiping blood from her hands with a stained cloth. "I've done what I can for the wounded, but several need proper facilities." She glanced between Jenkins and Ezra, immediately sensing the renewed tension. "What's happened?" Jenkins explained quickly, keeping his voice low. Eleanor's expression darkened as she grasped the implications. "So we're back to a standoff," she concluded grimly, with my patience caught in the middle. "Not for long," Ezra said, his decision already made. "Marshal, I need you to get Eleanor and the wounded out of here. Use the back exit through the corral." "And what will you be doing?" Jenkins demanded, though his tone suggested he already knew. "Creating a distraction," Ezra replied simply. Eleanor gripped his arm, her professional detachment giving way to genuine concern. "That's suicide, Ezra. Even you can't face Hammond and Hastings simultaneously." "I don't intend to," he assured her. "Just long enough for you to get clear." Jenkins studied him with the measured assessment of a man who had seen too many last stands. "There's another way," he said finally, "but you won't like it." "I'm listening," Ezra replied cautiously. "Arrest you myself," Jenkins explained. "Take you into custody for the Bald Mountain massacre. That gives me legal authority that even Hammond can't easily override, and cuts Hastings out completely." Ezra considered this, the tactical advantages clear, though the personal cost significant. "You'd be a target too," he pointed out. "Hammond can't afford witnesses any more than I can." "I've been a target since the first day I pinned on this star," Jenkins replied with the philosophical acceptance of a career lawman. "At least this way, we control the situation rather than reacting to it." After a moment's consideration, Ezra nodded once, accepting the plan's logic, if not its personal implications. "Do it!" Without further discussion, Jenkins withdrew his revolver, his voice carrying official authority as he addressed the entire stable. "Ezra Blackwood, you're under arrest for the murders at Bald Mountain mining camp. Surrender your weapons and come peacefully." The theatrical announcement had its intended effect, creating momentary confusion among both Hammond's soldiers and Hastings' gang. Ezra cooperated with deliberate meekness, allowing Jenkins to disarm him and secure his wrists with manacles that both men knew would present little challenge to his specialized training. "What is the meaning of this, Marshal?" Hammond demanded, approaching with controlled outrage. "This man is wanted by the United States Army for desertion, and this man is suspected of federal crimes," Jenkins interrupted firmly. "Jurisdiction falls to civil authority until proper military warrants are presented." He fixed Hammond with a stare that had faced down countless frontier troublemakers. "Unless you're planning to overrule territorial law with military force, Colonel, that would require quite an explanation to your superiors in Washington." Hammond's jaw tightened, but his military training recognized a strategic withdrawal when necessary. "This isn't over, Marshal." "Never thought it was," Jenkins replied evenly. He turned to Hastings, who had been watching the exchange with calculating interest. "As for you and your men, you've got 1 hour to clear out of my jurisdiction. After that, I'll consider you hostile forces threatening the peace of Timber Creek." Hastings's laugh held genuine amusement. "Playing a dangerous game, old man." His eyes shifted to Ezra, narrowing thoughtfully. "That reward money's federal. Your jailhouse won't keep me from collecting." "You're welcome to file a proper claim through legal channels," Jenkins replied, with deliberate bureaucratic pedantry. "I'm sure the paperwork will be processed efficiently." As Jenkins led Ezra from the stable, Deputy Taylor and Josephine flanking. Then with weapons ready, Eleanor supervised the transfer of the wounded to wagons that would transport them to her clinic in town. The uneasy truce held, but the temperature of calculated violence had merely cooled, not dissipated. The rain had stopped completely now, the rising sun burning away the storm clouds to reveal a sky washed clean of yesterday's dust and shadow. Timber Creek emerged from the night's violence battered but intact, its citizens cautiously reopening doors and windows as word spread that the immediate danger had passed. In the marshal's office, Jenkins secured Ezra in the single jail cell. Both men aware of the performance aspect of their arrangement. "It won't hold for long," Jenkins said quietly, once they were alone. "Hammond will generate whatever paperwork he needs to claim you, and Hastings isn't known for respecting legal niceties." "I know," Ezra acknowledged, sitting on the narrow cot with the relaxed posture of a man accustomed to confinement. "But it buys time for the town to prepare, and for the wounded to receive proper care." Jenkins studied him through the cell bars, seeing beyond the quiet deputy to the complex man beneath. "You could have escaped during the confusion, been halfway to the territorial border by now, and left you to face Hammond and Hastings alone." Ezra shook his head slightly. "Some debts can't be escaped, Marshal." "Reckon that's true enough," Jenkins agreed, settling behind his desk with a weary sigh. "Though most men wouldn't consider a few months' employment worth risking their life over." Ezra's smile was faint but genuine. It wasn't the employment, it was the home. The admission seemed to surprise even him, as if he'd only just recognized the truth of it. "First one I've had since before the war." Jenkins absorbed this with thoughtful silence, recognizing the weight such a statement carried from a man who had spent years as a living ghost. Before he could respond, Deputy Taylor burst through the door, his youthful face flushed with renewed alarm. "Marshal! Army patrols forming up on the North Road, and Hastings's boys are gathering by the creek crossing." His eyes darted nervously to Ezra. "Looks like neither of them planned to honor your deadline." Jenkins rose with the resigned determination of a man who had anticipated this development. "Get word to Dr. Finch. Tell her to move the wounded to the church basement, more defensible. Then find Josephine and anyone else willing to stand with us." As Taylor hurried to obey, Jenkins turned back to Ezra. "Reckon this is where the hard choices get made, son." Through the cell's small window, they could see the approaching forces. Hammond's disciplined soldiers advancing from the north, Hastings' more numerous gang converging from the south. Timber Creek lay between them, an insignificant frontier. Town about to become the battleground for powers that cared nothing for its survival. Ezra stood slowly, his manacled hands held before him in silent question. Jenkins hesitated only briefly before withdrawing the key. "Officially," the marshal said as he unlocked the cell, "you overcame me and escaped custody. I pursued but lost your trail in the aftermath of the storm." "And unofficially?" Ezra asked, rubbing his wrists as the manacles fell away. Jenkins' smile held grim humor. "Unofficially, I reckon it's time the ghost taught Hammond and Hastings why that name used to make grown men check under their beds at night." Outside, the converging forces drew closer, the final confrontation, approaching with the inevitability of judgment. But this time, Ezra Blackwood would not be running from his past. This time, the ghost would be the one haunting his hunters. The morning sun cast long shadows across Timber Creek as the town held, its breath caught between hammer and anvil. From the north, Colonel Hammond's remaining soldiers advanced in disciplined formation, their military precision a stark contrast to the chaotic approach of Hastings' gang from the south. Between these opposing forces stood a weathered jailhouse, its modest wooden structure now the focal point of a gathering storm. "They won't expect us to move first," Ezra observed, checking the revolver Jenkins had returned to him. His voice carried the calm certainty of a man who had faced impossible odds before and emerged victorious. Hammond will establish positions before advancing, and Hastings will wait to see what the soldiers do. Jenkins nodded. Years of frontier experience confirming the tactical assessment. So we surprise them both. We need to separate them, Ezra continued. Keep them from joining forces against the town. He glanced toward Deputy Taylor, who stood nervously by the window. The church basement secure? Yes, sir, Taylor confirmed. Dr. Finch has the wounded settled, and Josephine's organized the townspeople who can handle weapons. Good. Ezra's gaze returned to the advancing threats. One last question, Marshal. Do you still have that old cannon from the war? The one mounted in the square for Founders' Day celebrations? Jenkins's weathered face broke into a slow, appreciative smile. Been wondering when someone would remember that old thing. Taylor, fetch the powder and shot from the storeroom. As Taylor hurried to comply, Ezra outlined his plan. Audacious in its simplicity, lethal in its application. For once, the ghost would not rely on stealth and shadow, but on spectacle and surprise. 15 minutes later, Hammond's forces had established a perimeter at the north end of town, while Hastings' gang had taken positions among the buildings. To the south, the colonel himself stood with calculated visibility before his men, clearly expecting a negotiation before violence commenced. Hastings, more cautious, remained partially concealed behind the general store, the distinctive Lamat revolver gleaming in the morning light. Both leaders watched with professional interest as Marshal Jenkins emerged from the jailhouse alone, walking with unhurried confidence toward the ancient cannon positioned in the town square. With deliberate movements, he adjusted the weapon's angle, seemingly unconcerned by the deadly forces surrounding him. "Marshal Jenkins," Hammond called out, his voice carrying military authority. "I urge you to surrender the prisoner Blackwood. Immediately. This can end without further bloodshed." Jenkins made no response beyond a casual tip of his hat, continuing his preparations with methodical calm. From the south, Hastings grew impatient. "Old man's lost his mind," he muttered too. "His lieutenant. That cannon's just for show. Probably hasn't been fired since the mechs." The deafening roar interrupted his assessment as Jenkins touched flame to fuse. The ancient weapon belched smoke and fire, its payload not solid shot, but hundreds of metal, fragments that tore through the abandoned building Hastings had been using as cover. Splinters and debris exploded outward, forcing the outlaw gang to scramble for new positions, their formations disrupted. Before Hammond could capitalize on this distraction, movement from the jailhouse roof caught his attention. Ezra Blackwood stood silhouetted against the morning sky, not hiding but deliberately visible, a calculated provocation that Hammond immediately recognized as a trap, yet couldn't ignore. "Hold positions!" Hammond ordered his men, but too late. Two of his soldiers, eager to claim the bounty on the Butcher of Bald Mountain, broke ranks and fired at the distant figure. Their shots went wide as Ezra disappeared from view, seemingly melting into thin air with ghost-like efficiency. Seconds later, he materialized behind Hammond's left flank, moving through the soldiers with the fluid grace that had made his reputation. Not attacking, but drawing their attention, pulling their focus away from the town center toward the abandoned mill at the settlement's edge. Hammond recognized the strategy instantly. Ezra was separating the opposing forces, creating distinct battlefields to prevent the town from being caught in crossfire. The colonel's grudging admiration for his former operative's tactical brilliance was matched only by his determination to end this chase once and for all. "Flank positions! Converge on the mill!" Hammond commanded, leading his men in pursuit while maintaining disciplined formations. Meanwhile, Jenkins had reloaded the ancient cannon with remarkable speed, its second volley directed precisely at The ground before Hastings' new position. No casualties, but enough chaos and confusion to refocus the gang's attention on the immediate threat rather than Ezra's distant movements. The old man's mine, Hastings snarled, his patience exhausted. Take the rest of the boys and get after that ghost. As the outlaw leader advanced on Jenkins, the marshal stood his ground, shotgun ready but not yet raised. Behind him, Deputy Taylor and a handful of determined townspeople had taken defensive positions, prepared to protect their home regardless of the cost. The town's defenders wouldn't need to stand alone for long. As Hammond's soldiers surrounded the abandoned mill, they found themselves hunting shadows, glimpses of movement, sounds from unexpected directions, a pervasive sense of being watched by unseen eyes. The ghost was in his element, dismantling their military discipline with the psychological warfare he'd been created to employ. At the mill's center, Hammond finally confronted his former operative face to face, both men understanding this would be their final encounter. "You can't save them all, Ezra," Hammond said quietly, genuine regret coloring his tone. "Sooner or later, your past catches up." "Not today," Ezra replied with quiet certainty. The explosion that followed wasn't large, just enough to collapse. Key structural supports within the mill, trapping Hammond's men in separate compartments without killing them. Ezra had rigged the ancient building during the night, preparing for contingencies with the thoroughness Hammond himself had taught him. As timber groaned and dust filled the air, only Hammond remained free, standing amidst the controlled destruction. With newfound respect in his eyes, "You planned all of this," he realized, "from the moment we arrived." "Go back to Washington, Colonel," Ezra said, his voice carrying neither triumph nor malice. "Tell them the ghost died at Timber Creek, in a way he did." In town, Hastings discovered too late that he'd walked into a trap of his own. Josephine and Dr. Finch had positioned sharpshooters in the church bell tower, while Jenkins's ancient cannon had been precision-aimed at the outlaw's only escape route. Surrounded, outmaneuvered, and with his gang scattered, Hastings found himself facing the one thing his brutality couldn't overcome, a community united against him. By sunset, Hammond's chastened forces had withdrawn from Timber Creek, taking their wounded but leaving their ambitions behind. Hastings and his surviving lieutenants occupied the jail cells they'd sought to breach. Their reign of terror ended not by federal forces, but by a town that had found its courage. And Ezra Blackwood. Marshal Jenkins discovered a badge and a brief note on his desk the following morning. "Some ghosts need to keep moving, others find a place worth haunting. Thank you for showing me the difference." Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.